Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Happy Women's History Month. We are very excited to be kicking this off with all of you. This is our first official program of Women's History Month, by design, of course. So we are here to celebrate Drastic Dykes and Accidental Activists, Queer Women in the Urban South by Shonda Mims. It's got this great cover. And Shonda is an assistant professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University. She's concerned with the intersections of gender, race, region, and queer identity. And her new book, Drastic Dykes and Accidental Activists, was published by the University of North Carolina Press, and it examines lesbian life in Atlanta, Georgia, and Charlotte, North Carolina. Her 2019 article, published in the Journal of Women's History, explores lesbian feminist action in the urban New South. Mims is currently at work on two research projects. The first interrogates the transnational history of Pentecostalism and queer identity, while her newest work examines mass incarceration and sex policing. So welcome, Shonda. We're so glad to have you here. And Shonda is joined tonight by the one and only Julie Enszer, who is the author of 4 poetry collections, including Avowed, and the editor of Outright, the speeches that shaped LGBTQ literary culture. Fire-Rimmed Eden, selected poems by Lynn Lonadier, the complete works of Pat Parker, and Sister Love, the letters of Audre Lorde and Pat Parker, 1974 to 1989. Enszer edits and publishes Sinister Wisdom, a multicultural lesbian literary and art journal. And of course, Sinister Wisdom features prominently in our discussion tonight, which is why we wanted Julie to be here with us to really talk about, this key project. And of course, Charis is involved as well. So it feels like Old Home Week. We're really glad to be here to celebrate this book with you. I'm a big fan of urban history and comparative histories. So this is exciting for me. I want to encourage folks who are watching from around the world. You can ask questions at any time. Feel free to put, your questions in the chat. I see Rhonda Joe Downs just asked, will Charis be at AWP next week? I can answer that quickly. Alas, we will not. I wish that we were. We just came back from the American Booksellers Association conference in Seattle, so we are ships in the night. But I shout out to all our AWP friends. I hope that you all have a wonderful time in Seattle. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here.
Great.
Thank you, E.R.
Thank you, E.R. Good evening to everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is going to be a fascinating discussion about histories of Southern urban lesbians with my friend, Dr. Shonda Mims. I want to thank E.R. again, and also Dartricia for their work in helping make this program happen tonight, as well as my colleague Sierra, who ably helped with promotion at Sinister Wisdom. If you do not know, this is my little advertisement. Charis Books and More, and its nonprofit affiliate Charis Circle relies on community support. That means not only buying the book tonight, and there's the green bar at the bottom by Drastic Dykes and Accidental Activists, which you can click on and it will take you to another browser and you'll still be here with us and you can purchase the book. So it's important that you purchase the book, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But also Charis relies on donations from community members who value these spaces. And a contribute box just automatically popped up. I know I was just doing my taxes, and I was happy with what we gave to Charis last year because some of my best evenings of 2022 were virtually with Charis, like we are this evening. But I know that we could do more this year. So I challenge you all to do that as well. If you're able to support Charis, not only with book buying dollars, but also charitable donations, do that. This evening, we will be taking audience questions, as E.R. has already demonstrated. So I look forward to your thoughts. Put them in the Ask a Question button or drop them into the chat. Also, chat away, particularly if you have stories that amplify the discussion. And I think some of you will have additional stories that I know Shonda would also love to hear. So, Shonda, welcome. First of all, thank you. I'll hold up the book. Thank you for writing this one. Whoops, I'm holding it upside down. Thank you for writing this wonderful book, Drastic Dykes and Accidental Activists. It explores a lot of Southern lesbian history, one of our favorite things. And I know you used extensive archival resources to assemble the story of lesbians in the South. It goes from 1940 until 2000. So I wondered if you would just start off by telling us a bit about how Charlotte and Atlanta emerged as the focus of this book from your archival work.
Sure. Thank you all for being here. I'm glad I can't see who's here because I think I'd be really nervous. I'm already pretty nervous. So thank you for coming. So selfishly and honestly, Charlotte and Atlanta played big roles in my personal life. I'm not from either city, but I went to school in both cities for undergrad and grad. I'm a Georgia State undergrad and UNC Charlotte master's student. Where I taught for several years. And as I was coming out officially, I'd been, unofficially out. But honestly, to myself, I was in grad school and at UNC Charlotte and making my way down the Atlanta highway, as the B-52s say, for Pride, headed down to Atlanta for Pride. And I started percolating about that sort of, it felt like there were a ton of us making that journey to Atlanta. And I was really thinking about the ways in which we were leaving Charlotte and other cities around the South that were equally important and vibrant, but we were all headed to Atlanta. So that was part of what led me to think about putting them in conversation. And then when I got to the University of Georgia to do my doctorate, I took a class that inspired me to think about comparative history. I was already an urban historian. I was already someone who had figured out while doing my master's degree that you could do queer history. I didn't even know that was a thing until I did my master's degree. And so when I got to the University of Georgia, I began thinking about comparative history. And so these were the two cities that had played such a big role in my life in recent years at that time. And I began to want to sort of think about the ways they were interacting with one another, because having come from a public history background and worked in public history, mostly in Charlotte, I was highly aware of ways in which Charlotte and Atlanta kind of worked to claim position as leader of the New South. Of course, all Atlantans would say, no, we win. And maybe you're right, but Charlotteans would counter that with several examples. And some of them were playing out in real time while I was writing this work.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And how did you, it's a huge expanse of time, right? And the early part, which we're not going to talk as much about, but is really interesting, the 40s and 50s. So you go from the 40s to the 2000s, over 5 chapters. I'll tell folks the chapter titles, which are Opportunities, Connections, Visibility, Pride, and Institutions. How did you research such a broad time frame?
Well, I would say, though you didn't ask it, my chapter titles are one word because I really suck at chapter titles. But I did want to organize the book both thematically and chronologically. And that was actually quite difficult for me. But historians, we love chronology. But I'm also a women and gender studies scholar. And the themes that were coming to me from the archival sources suggested these kinds of spaces and places. And so I went into this thinking about my mentors. John D'Amelio notably writes that World War II was a watershed moment for lesbians and gay men. And I wanted to take it back to at least the mid-century, but happily, while doing my doctoral work, fell into the Atlanta History Center, and a lovely archivist who's no longer there, but was so important to this work, Wesley Chenault. And Wesley kindly was working on his own dissertation and kindly shared so many sources. And what I found was some oral histories that were begun under a project that John Howard began, really important thinker in Southern history, and a group of students at Emory had put together some oral histories there. And I started reading through them and was struck by one in particular, a lesbian by the name of Ginny Boyd. And so I allowed her story to kind of give me a feel for what Atlanta looked like. And then I began to sort of build out her world with some other folks in Atlanta. I could not take Charlotte that far back at the time I was doing the research. I know Charlotte is actively building their archives, so I know that's going to change. And then I wanted to end, again, we are, even though the history profession is debating this actively right now, I believe that historians are deeply influenced by the present moment in which we write. And my coming out process, my claiming my lesbian identity, but also watching the fight for visibility through marriage equality, though I understand that as a problematic framework, watching President Obama evolve happened on the heels of some pretty nasty fights in Charlotte, in North Carolina broadly, to stop marriage equality. And that was happening in our own neighborhood there in Charlotte. And I'll say in a minute why that was so deeply important to Sinister Wisdom history as well. So anyway, that to me felt like a really good space to end the book, was, you know, Obama evolves and it has this tie to North Carolina and Charlotte in particular. And so I took it to that time period in the epilogue.
Mm-hmm. And now I wonder, could you talk a little bit about how, because of course, if you're writing Southern history, you have to grapple with race. And a lot of us today live in very segregated communities and very segregated worlds. And a lot of the women you're writing about also did. And at the same time, for a lot of the lesbians, right, they were thinking a lot about anti-racist work and how to build alliances in different ways. Can you talk a little bit about your journey in thinking about race through this history?
I'd love to. And you may have to cut me off, because I would say at least 2 to 5 years of this process. I chart this book is really taking 20 years of my life. And there were 2 or 3 years where I just kind of froze with this book. And Julie knows this. I talked to her about it at length. And I received some early reader feedback on a version of the book, pretty fresh out of the dissertation phase. And I was starting to put that research into a book form. And the feedback was, you haven't considered race. And I froze, because I thought I had considered it deeply. And I know my brain had considered it deeply, but it wasn't coming through in the writing. And it's interesting. It takes me back to my Georgia State women's studies class in the early 90s, when I went into that class thinking I was such a forward-thinking, anti-racist activist. And one of my colleagues in that class said, "You don't understand white privilege." And I was gutted. It was the first time I'd ever heard the phrase. So I've had these moments over my life where I've been called out on my whiteness. And I think that moment was really important for me to think about what's happening with race in this book. And a couple of things took place. Again, I froze for a while, really worrying about how I would deal with that. Secondly, increasingly, I've been aware, as I write in the positionality statement, that many people assume, and I've known this for quite some time, that I'm a Black woman because of my name. And I teach Black history. I've studied Black history, but have often walked into classes and felt the need to address that. So I felt like I needed to address that in the book, that I am a white woman. But I also ran into some interactions with Black lesbians and Black archives, where Black lesbians were really pushing back and saying, we want to tell our stories. We own these stories. They are our stories. I had a really productive talk with E. Patrick Johnson, who has written some of the most important or visible work on Black queer histories. And he was incredibly encouraging about writing this work. And I did. That helped me pick back up. But I also heard from another mentor, Jenny Breyer, a historian of AIDS, and she pointed out, whiteness is also race, right? And so you can harness the whiteness and work your way through this project while still acknowledging the separation between white and Black women. And what I knew I did not want to do, Julie, was to just have a chapter, right? I didn't want to separate that out. But I also didn't want to have a small handful of oral histories from Black women or brown women who did feel comfortable talking to me and have that somehow be representative. And I had an overwhelming amount of white sources. And so I even at one point grappled with calling this white queer women in the urban South. I really struggled. And in the end, any critiques that come my way will be valid. But they will not come to a person that has not given it a lot of thought. And I'm happy to answer more questions about it tonight.
Great. So the book is Drastic Dykes and Accidental Activists. I want to pause with another little commercial because the other night, for the first time since the pandemic, I was actually live in a bookstore at a reading. And I got there and I did what I hope you all did at the beginning. And I bought my copy that I was going to have the author sign. And then I sat and listened to the author read from the book and talk about the book. And I realized that there were 3 more people that I wanted to read this book. So after the reading, I went up and I bought 3 more copies so that I could mail them out to those other people that needed to read the book. So if that is you sitting in the audience, you don't even have to go back to the cash register. You can just click on the link again and buy multiple copies to share with people. So that's my advertisement for Drastic Dykes and Accidental Activists. I'll hold it up again. So LaShonda knows I want to selfishly talk about a bit about the 3rd chapter, which includes this really fabulous reading of Sinister Wisdom and this thinking about separatism, which are 2 topics that I feel really passionately about. So we're going to use this as an opportunity for LaShonda to read a little bit so you can get some more flavor of the book. And so LaShonda, would you read those first 2 paragraphs from the 3rd chapter, which is visibility? And get us started there. And also I'll just echo that Meryl's in the audience and LaShonda and I talked to Meryl this summer, and they're also talking about the Southern Lesbian Feminist Activist Herstory Project, and there's a link there in the chat. But LaShonda, go ahead, read from the beginning of chapter 3.
Yes, I would love to. So I really want to say, Julie, and I hope it's okay, how I came to find Sinister Wisdom. May I share that now?
Yes.
So I was in Duke Archives on a fellowship, and I was looking at I just was like, give me your Charlotte queer stuff, give me your Atlanta queer stuff. But I was really interested in Charlotte because I was having a hard time finding Charlotte stuff. And so I started looking at the Charlotte Women's Center newsletter, and I was fascinated by what was going on, but it was a very spotty group of newsletters. They weren't like, I didn't have every month. I didn't know everything that was going on, but they mentioned this, Sinister Wisdom came up. And I was like, what is that? And so I went and asked the fantastic Kelly Wooten, archivist extraordinaire at Duke. And she's like, let me bring it out to you. And she did. And I opened the first issue and I turned the cover, and it said the address of the the home for Catherine and Harriet, where it began. And it was Country Club Drive. And I lived right around the corner in Charlotte. I just came undone right there. I couldn't believe it. And so when I drove back, of course, to Charlotte, I was like, oh my God, we have to go. I'm right by this house. I'm meant to write this history. So that's how I ran into Sinister Wisdom. And then fabulously, Kelly Wooten introduced me to Julie, and the rest is literally history, as we know. So this is chapter 3. Quote, "We are gone from the Women's Center because remaining involved with the center meant continuing to put a lot of energy into women who were in turn giving a lot of energy to men. It is so much more complicated than that, of course. Lots of anger, lots of hurt all around, end quote. With these words, lesbian feminist Joy Justice announced the 1975 departure of the separatist group Drastic Dykes from the Charlotte Women's Center, CWC, and the home and meeting space for a group of primarily white feminists in Charlotte, North Carolina. The departure of the Drastic Dykes was a personal and political decision to separate from other local feminists, some lesbian and some not, at the CWC. The Dykes felt an immediate need to plant their lives in radically different ground, or else face the destruction of the planet, quote, sooner than anyone thought, with the most vulnerable among us being sacrificed first, end quote. Choosing a temporary separatist model allowed the Drastic Dykes to follow a path of self-discovery, personal political action, and community building. As a cadre of white feminists who were successful in their separatism, as attested to by their publishing efforts, visibility, and protest of patriarchal structures, Joy Justice and the Drastic Dykes challenged the narrative of white lesbian separatism as a failure. Through the group's self-published magazine, Sinister Wisdom, the Drastic Dykes in Charlotte united lesbian voices in print, creating a national network of lesbian feminists who depended on the publishing work of women who called the South home. The action, activism, and community building work of Sinister Wisdom continued well beyond the immediacy of its original separatist lesbian feminist vision in the 1970s.
So that's so lovely. So there's this like break of the Drastic Dykes from the Women's Center, right? People are having a little conflict and going their different separate ways. And I think you really kind of lay out some terms of both Charlotte history, but also this kind of period of this cauldron of activism that people had, and also this kind of sense of possibilities that people could break apart and do different types of activism for social change and ways to be true to their principles. And I think that's one of the things, the real strengths of this book is the way it captures that activism, that passion, that possibility that people have in a really immediate way. So, of course, the chapter gives us a lot more detail, but we're going to skip through and read a little bit in the middle, from the middle about this, of what happens next. So if you want to start at the bottom of page 73.
Sure.
We'll pick up about the Dykes from CWC.
The Dykes who left the CWC were determined to live emotionally beyond the constraints of patriarchy, to separate from men as well as heterosexual women. Lesbian separatists sought a life that would be free of patriarchal entanglements. They broke from the feminist movement because women who were married to men or associated with them functioned within a patriarchal society. Even in their roles as sisters to brothers, wives to husbands, daughters to fathers, and mothers to sons, non-separatists were part of the patriarchy, which wielded political power over women. Propelled by their anger and determined to pursue their separation from a life dominated by men, the 7 white women who formed the original Drastic Dykes each made individual sacrifices. Nicholson left her academic career, 2 other women quit college, and all faced challenges in separating from lovers, family, and friends. It was in this separatist mindset that Sinister Wisdom took shape, with a belief that the only way to achieve true feminist ideals was to be separate from all forms of patriarchal power. Women, even lesbians, who stayed at the Charlotte Women's Center, struggled with the Dykes' position, in part because they could not make sense of political separatism. Joy Justice detailed her understanding of the separatist split at the CWC in an article for Sinister Wisdom. Quote, "We did not become separatists because we wanted to separate ourselves from the world. In fact, for the first 5 or 6 months that Drastic Dykes met, we met at the Women's Center and were individually still very much involved with the straight women at the center. But this tense," end quote, "this tense coexistence did not last." And again, I'm quoting here. When straight women and other lesbians were frightened and angry with us because of what we thought, we became more angry until finally there were no straight women coming to the center. We were left with the choice of continuing to run a women's center for women who would not come to meetings because we were there, or leaving. We left. End quote. Justice hoped that those who remained at the CWC would come after them and beg them to stay. But instead, she found that, her words, isolation was the ultimate result.
So one of the things that's so interesting and I think lovely about this story, and part of why I wanted to lift it up, is that, there's two things. One is there's, in some ways, a lesbian heterosexual split happening in this history that you're putting together, which is not the first one that we see in feminism. But there's stories that are much more told and retold. The split at Now, the Lavender Menace, Rita Mae Brown in that incredibly hot T-shirt that says Lavender Menace. And then you also are then sketching out a real formative moment around lesbian separatism rooted in Charlotte, North Carolina, rooted in the South, where we have other origin stories of lesbian separatism really coming out of not completely a Northeastern milieu, although there's a lot of origin stories related to Northampton and other places. But I think that one of the big origin stories is based in Washington, D.C. and the Furies. So, of course, D.C. is south of the Mason-Dixon line, but in many ways, a lot of the Furies aligned a bit more, let's say, with the North and with the South. So my question for you is, what can we learn by looking at these stories from the South, even when we already have some stories from the North?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think in the South, and this is a theme throughout the book, respectability politics, which has often been used as a tool for understanding and a tool for analyzing and even behaving in Black communities and Black history, was something that white women and Black women, but in queer communities, but in general, adopted often to get their political or activist efforts to move forward. We see this a lot in the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. This sort of Julia Sugar Baker style kind of Southern Steel Magnolia kind of thing, right? That's one thing. I think class plays a really big role here too in access to education, which a lot of Southern, if you think about the Furies, the Southern activists in Charlotte and Atlanta, particularly in Charlotte, though certainly Catherine and Harriet and some of the others came out of an academic tradition or even found themselves ending up in academia, that did not play the central role in their lives. Their lives weren't structured around that in the same way. And the spaces that they were in the U.S. South were urban, but the urbanism still carried the flavor of Southern identity, which John Howard asks that we consider the 3 R's. We consider region, we consider religion, we consider race when we think. And so the other big piece is the issue of race and the efforts that Southern activists were making to fight issues of racism every day. And so I have a story in the book, for example, about the Sinister Wisdom house and a KKK leader being in that neighborhood on that block and sort of terrorizing Harriet and Catherine and other women that would come and go with that house. And so that the stench of racism that's obviously still here and throughout the U.S. has a different immediacy in these neighborhoods, perhaps. And you don't, especially in Charlotte, you don't have that kind of neighborhood that you might find in a New England town or even in Atlanta in Little Five Points that is kind of surrounded by universities and surrounded by that kind of outlet for support. The women in Charlotte were quite a ways away from UNC Charlotte, and UNC Charlotte was, barely 10 years old and not who they would become at this point when the women were starting Sinister Wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the other things that really comes out in the book is that relationship between lesbians and lesbian activists and heterosexual allies and a broader perceived heterosexual community that you really map out in interesting ways. I want to lift up Nancy Wexler asked, is there anything in the book about Alpha? And I said, yes, the Alpha Archives is used extensively, but will you add a little bit about Alpha at this juncture?
Absolutely. Alpha is the reason I have this book, the reason I found the Charlotte Women's Center. So if I trace that whole archival finding experience, it's the women of Alpha and their fantastic library, which those were the archives that led me to the Charlotte Women's Center. And I have to be honest with you, I was even though I graduated from Georgia State, I was not an out lesbian at that time. I was canoodling with women, but I wasn't there yet on my own personal journey. And I certainly didn't think of myself. I was an activist, but more concerned with other issues around race at the time. And so I guess I say all that to say, and Alpha had ended at that point, but I wasn't in the queer activist movement in Atlanta when I lived there. And so coming back to Alpha, coming back to the history of Charis was so healing for me because I had been there and been in those spaces, but didn't really understand their history until I started working on the book. But Alpha plays a huge role here, and I talk about the importance of that group. And in particular, just a small plug, if any of you are around the Athens, Georgia area, I have a talk coming up there at UGA where I'm going to talk about the National Lesbian Conference and Alpha, and I'll be focused on that at that time.
Great. And I hope you call for like a 50th anniversary conference because we're coming up on the 50th anniversary. We should like have another big Southern gathering, but that's a little side commercial. We have a question from Rose who says, what do we know about the Drastic Dykes' personal history? Were they Southerners, transplants? Did the ones who dropped out of college ever go back?
Such a good question. And I fear that my brain will fail me a little bit on each path that each woman took. But what I do know is that they were all of the above. And I've been in touch with a few of the Drastic Dykes, and I know at least a couple of them did indeed go back to college and did indeed consider or continue their life as teachers, educators, and activists. And were very kind to talk to me years and years ago. But, you know, what we also know, and you and the audience and Julie know even better than I do, is that Harriet and Catherine don't keep the journal in Charlotte that long for a variety of reasons. But I argue for the Southern moment of Drastic Dykes and Sinister Wisdom because it did take shape in these spaces where, as Julie rightly points out, there was almost a reliance, a troubled reliance on straight structures within the neighborhoods, because I mean, these were just staid, not necessarily super wealthy neighborhoods, but solidly middle-class neighborhoods near a country club, but not near enough to be too, wealthy yet. And we know that the white communities, particularly around Charlotte Women's Center, which was where Drastic Dykes took early root, that neighborhood, Dilworth, was an activist, radical community. And I talked to some residents of that neighborhood who helped me understand a lot about the Purple House, where the Charlotte Women's Center met. But it is true, Rose, that I can't right now off the top of my head give you each of their trajectory. And I'm not sure that I follow them all the way throughout individually, but certainly personally in doing the research, I emailed with the ones that I could get a hold of, particularly Joy Justice, who no longer goes by Joy, and Jan Millsaps and some others.
Great. Bethany asks, is there any work comparing the Drastic Dykes to political lesbians? And does your work address this in any way?
Such a good question. To my knowledge, there hasn't been much written about the Drastic Dykes other than my book and James Sears's book. James Sears's papers were important to me in writing this history. And certainly Sinister Wisdom has tons and tons of that history. But the comparative look at political lesbianism, I do a little bit to think about the ways in which lesbians were political during the 1970s and 80s, but I don't necessarily do that comparative work. I think it'd be a great line for further research for sure.
I mean, because, you know, and a part of the whole kind of political lesbian, as I understand it, also was like women who sort of might have, I'm trying to phrase this in the nicest way. And Bethany, you could jump in the chat and help as well if this is what you're thinking of. But I think of women who identified as political lesbians because they wanted to cast their lot with lesbians in a public space, but they might cast their lots with men in the private bedroom. So political lesbians, this kind of formation of women who were public allies. And there was also a lot of, as you might, since lesbians have something to say about everything, there's a lot of debate about this type of practice, and lesbians had all kinds of feels about it at the time.
Absolutely. There's so much more work to be done on political women's history in the U.S. South. The author Janet Alured does great work on the Equal Rights Amendment in the U.S. South. And that's where I get into a little bit of how lesbians, and particularly members of Alpha, interacted with women fighting for the ERA, et cetera. So I do tell some of those stories.
And Lashonda, this is a great time to sort of think about this question. Why are Southern lesbian stories so underexplored?
You know, this is such a good question. And I'll be honest, Julie gave me this question before we talked tonight, and I've really been grappling with it. When I decided to write this book, where I started to look was women's history. And when I looked at women's history, I wasn't finding lesbian history. And then I looked in Southern history, and when I looked at Southern history, I wasn't finding queer history. And then I looked in urban history, and I wasn't finding U.S. Southern cities, particularly Charlotte, some on Atlanta. And so I think there has been, you know, the easy answer is there's a general assumption that, oh, you know, it's just so hard to be queer. We can't tell those stories. And then when I first started doing the book, lots of people were like, how are you going to do that? There aren't going to be many sources. And thankfully, over the 20-year course of this book, a lot of what I relied on and worked in the archives to uncover is now digitized and quite easily accessed. I think that's part of it. I think that in 20 years of thinking about this project, the archives have been, we can access them in a way that we couldn't before. And so I think that's part of why we weren't seeing them. But I also think, and I've said this often, that Southern women's stories are seen through certain tropes that are the steel magnolia, are the sort of, you know, racist, gone with the wind, Scarlet kind of stories that don't allow for queerness. John Howard's work and others who've looked at the queer South, and I keep referring to Howard's work because there just isn't that much of queer Southern history, have looked at the importance of class. And I think when we start to talk about class, women are, especially working and lower class women, are kept quiet. And when you think about lack of access to education, which was harder in the South, then that silenced women even more. And honestly, I'll just go back to the archives. These resources just weren't collected, and they weren't saved, and they weren't sought after in the ways they've been in the last 10 years, because really things have exploded. And there's so many good graduate students right now working on the US South, and I'm excited about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it too was that women were, invested in kind of creating change more than creating archives. And that's one thing that as time has passed, that balance has shifted a little bit. Rose also asked, does Charlotte draw lesbians from small Southern towns as Atlanta does? Is Charlotte kind of a magnet like Atlanta?
Yeah, that's a great question. I saw some of that. Mm-hmm. But I really saw women bypass it at Charlotte for Atlanta around the, and I don't look at, lots of folks have asked, do you look at other cities? For a variety of reasons, I don't. I had a hard enough time getting the stories of Charlotte and Atlanta. But I really, when I do look at the stories of women in and around Charlotte, they either lived in Charlotte or they were flying right past Charlotte, literally or figuratively. They were just speeding through on 85 on their way, or they were going somewhere like Asheville, which I do talk about a little bit because as most of the folks here know, Asheville is a bit of a lesbian mecca. So that's another story and another rich history that LaToya Eves has done good work on, queer women in Asheville. But it's a really good question. I think that's changed in more recent years. But I do think in the late 20th century and mid 20th century, people that were in Charlotte were there for business often and for work. And if they wanted to do queer partying, sometimes they built community in Charlotte. But around Charlotte, they would just go on to Atlanta.
So there's a way that rather than state by state, where the cities become a mecca, and you explore some of this, it's not a direct, like people in rural North Carolina go to Charlotte. Atlanta is more of a regional hub. And you make some arguments about, you want to talk a little bit about why does Atlanta become more of a lesbian mecca than Charlotte?
Oh, I mean, the easy answer, the go-to gut reaction would be, oh, well, Atlanta's just a bigger city. But if you look at sheer numbers and the way in which Charlotte annexed land around Charlotte, so it could be bigger and have bigger numbers, it's not always the case. For Atlanta, it's transportation. That matters a lot. It becomes quickly, first railroad, but then quickly with Delta Airlines becomes a transportation hub, and that matters a lot. But Atlanta has global corporate buy-in and global corporations. And one of the things I struggled with in this book was I do give some credit to corporate growth in the cities. And no, I am not, pro-capitalism. I do have critiques of capitalism, but it is true that business and corporations played a big role in queer life in Atlanta and Charlotte. But in Atlanta, the businesses that grew up had staying power, and there were more of them to become visibly supportive on the larger scale of queer communities. That didn't always mean that they were the supporting things that maybe appealed to lesbians in specific, but it made for a broader sort of queer space or gayborhood where lesbians might frequent or build community or find work that paid more and find spaces that allowed them to socialize more than they would in Charlotte. And so I think all of those things, and then the dynamic global growth that Atlanta experiences at the 20th century, end of the 20th century, kind of seals the deal. The other thing I talk a lot about in the book at the end is sports, and national sports play a big role in each of these cities, and national sports teams have staying power in Atlanta in a way that they don't in Charlotte. And we all know the WNBA is like lesbian church and has some staying power in Atlanta in a way that it absolutely did not in Charlotte. But just sports on the whole, and that kind of buy-in and support. We've seen sports teams, for better or for worse, take some leadership and fail sometimes when it comes to issues of social justice. And having those teams matters in an urban space for queer support at times, and just matters for women to be able to find places they can earn more.
Yep. I'll just raise up. Christiana says in the chat, from personal experience growing up in North Carolina, I would agree that Charlotte was not a place I considered when I was looking to get out of a small town and looking for community. Atlanta, Asheville, and Durham were the places that Christiana considered. So thank you for that comment. Cookie asks, our friend Cookie Woolner, how did the early AIDS crisis specifically affect Southern lesbians? Did they get more involved in activism?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Cookie. So what I will say is that I don't have as much as I'd like on women, particularly in Charlotte, but there's so much more to be written on how women play a role in responding to the AIDS crisis in both cities. But what is clear is that activism in Charlotte becomes cohesive and women fight back against oppression and discrimination, anti-AIDS, anti-queer, anti-gay men, etc., around the mid-90s, late 80s. We start to see these communities coalesce in Charlotte. And I'm saying Charlotte here because the communities were already building and had some organized spaces to look to in Atlanta, but Charlotte had a hard time keeping these communities steady. But they start to build and coalesce and maintain longevity in and around the AIDS crisis and pushing back against some of the anti-AIDS rhetoric, most notably in Charlotte. And there's a fight like this in Atlanta, but it's in the suburbs in Marietta. But most notably in Charlotte around a showing or a local theater production of Angels in America. And I detail the ins and outs of that political brouhaha. I mean, it's a nightmare. And that really brings out an organized political response, and lesbians are leading the way there in Charlotte on that issue.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, I wish, as I was reading this, I was thinking, I wish that some of these struggles were all a part of history and a part of our past. But as Bethany asks in this question, how do you see the way states like Tennessee and Florida and ER added in Georgia now too are legislating queerness affecting the future of being able to do this history? So Bethany, I want to tweak your question a little bit and first say that LaShonda did this really wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post as Tennessee was considering their anti-drag bill. And I will try and hunt that up, but maybe someone also listening in might drop that link into the chat for us. And so one piece is like, what can this history tell us as we face down these contemporary challenges. And then I'm going to come back to Bethany's other part of question is like, does what's happening now affect our ability to do histories like what you've done? But first of all, what can we learn from your history to address the current challenges?
I mean, what I see in these histories is resilience. I see resilience and a commitment to, yes, you know, when I teach social movements to my students, you know, I often ask them, would you have been on the agitation crew on the outside of the problem, or would you have been the, you know, like inside the structure, right? The political, you know, plans, the political lesbians or what have you. And most of them want to be on the agitation side. And what I notice that is successful for activists in both cities, accidental or drastic, is a combination of the two and a willingness to work with both, because there are fights about respectability. There are fights about, oh, we don't want the, like, you know, taffeta wearing drag queens at our pride. We need to be a little more respectable. And that actually comes out of Atlanta rhetoric. But Charlotte's saying it too. Lots of lesbians are pushing back at Charlotte in the 90s when they bring a statewide pride event there. Lesbians are like, we don't like the mailer that you sent to us because it has naked people or it implies their nakedity, their nudity. But what I see is that the organizers and the leaders of these movements and these actions are hearing that complaint, and they are validating that complaint, and they are still organizing, and they are still bringing in. I think in the South, we have to continue, like, understanding that some people will need, for whatever reason, to fit in the structure, and some will be able to agitate outside, and using the power, especially of our whiteness and of our class privilege. I know here at MTSU, where our drag wearing governor just signed into law an anti-drag bill, we are working hard to push back and value our students. And those of us that can afford to be visible are visible. But we have to understand there are those that can't for a variety of reasons. And I think working across those lines really matters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then how about to Bethany's question, that other part, do you see, you know, well, particularly I'm in Florida, and our governor, you know, is trying to muck around and like end critical race studies and women's and gender studies and sort of change how we approach knowledge and learning at our state university systems. Do you have concerns about some of the legislative stuff that's happening about it impinging on your ability to do this history in the future?
I absolutely do. I feel nervous, and I felt nervous when I taught in Georgia at Kennesaw State. I remember walking over in my general ed history classes and shutting the door because I'm like, I'm going to actually say the word sex like 3 or 4 times now. And I don't want someone walking by my classroom and taking something out of context. But now, of course, people can just record it. And they could at the time too, but I worry about it all the time. But I don't come from a place of financial privilege, but I do come from a place now of privilege within the academy. I'm not quite tenured. I'm hoping that op-ed doesn't keep me from getting tenure, but I'm pretty situated in my department, and I feel supported there, and they knew what I did, and they knew who I was when they hired me, and I feel like I have no choice but to be visible for my students. I do worry about our archives. I think we have to be thoughtful about protecting these archives and doing good work like Julie's done with Sinister Wisdom. Make it visible online, put it in places it can't be taken away. Because when I worked with the National Park Service and several of my good colleagues in history, and Megan Springett, notably on preserving, queer spaces with the National Park Service. And then the Trump administration came in and shut down those websites. And, Megan and others had done good work to preserve that. So I think we have good archivists on our side, and we must keep pushing to do the work that Alpha did and keeping those community archives and putting them in smart and safe places, so that we have the histories and continue to do the work and tell the work.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think one of the things that your history reminds us, and so much of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender history that's coming out now, is that people have struggled in the past and resisted, and that we can be equal to the task as they were. That what we're facing today, to me, is disturbing and concerning, but people face down other challenges in the past really with incredible persistence and effectiveness, and brought us to where we are today. As we've been through the audience questions, I want to just bring us back to your chapter conclusion. Have you read a little bit more, because I love this chapter so much on Sinister Wisdom and the separatism stuff. And so there's a little selection where you do this really beautiful synthesis and kind of thinking about what this teaches us. So I thought if you would read that to take us into the conclusion, and then I'll wrap up after that.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Often described as temporary and holding idealistic goals, 1970s separatist lesbian feminist communities throughout the United States proclaimed their commitments to political action and revolution. Lesbian separatist scholarship repeatedly turns to the Furies of Washington, D.C., often seen as the epitome of lesbian feminist separatism, even as the group's ideological platform was divisive and arrogant. In their own writings, the Furies acknowledge their fight for survival. In our ardor and enthusiasm for what we've discovered, lesbians may be arrogant at times. However, most lesbian chauvinism is a survival reaction developed to get us through the roadblocks that straight feminists erect against our ideas and experiences. That's from the Furies. Relying on the history of the Furies to understand lesbian feminist separatism leaves a gap in our understanding of local approaches and successes born of the ideology of separatism. Understanding lesbian feminist separatism at the regional level in the context of the urban space that shaped its growth allows us to see what worked and what did not for lesbians, feminists, and separatist lesbian feminists in Atlanta and Charlotte. Charis and Alpha remained in Atlanta's vibrant Little Five Points neighborhood beyond the 1970s, and their tenacity is an example of how lesbian feminism in Atlanta differed from that in the Queen City of Charlotte. While Charis and Alpha were going strong, participation in the production of Sinister Wisdom began to wane, which would contribute to Harriet Des Moines and Catherine Nicholson's decision to move the magazine out of North Carolina at the end of the decade. Just a few years after it began publishing in a flurry of fire and dramatic passion, Sinister Wisdom left Charlotte for Lincoln, Nebraska, and the Drastic Dykes seemed to disappear with its exit. Meanwhile, the Charlotte Women's Center struggled to maintain a physical space, and its early commitment to lesbian visibility wavered. Charlotte Women supported an energetic chapter of NOW, and it would be at a NOW meeting in Charlotte that would draw Minnie Bruce Pratt to the Queen City and facilitate her love affair with Chris South. Charlotte also attempted to maintain a Gay Liberation Front chapter and briefly formed an organization known as the Charlotte Gay Alliance for Freedom. In spite of these organizations, the visibility that was necessary to sustain activism in Charlotte was too high a price for many. Socializing was the focus, not gay liberation. While gay men's bars and baths thrived, activist groups struggled against a tide of queer Charlotteans who were not willing to align themselves with the movement. In a city that wrestled with its own identity, gay liberation activists and lesbian feminists mirrored this identity crisis, often preferring to remain within Charlotte's invisible demi-monde. Quiet lesbian and queer writing blossomed in Charlotte's isolating neighborhoods, but a permanent, visible, and physical space devoted to, or at least encouraging of, lesbians was harder to achieve in Charlotte. Local sites of print media production, like Alpha, produced homegrown feminist communities that worked to distribute feminist messages on a broad and perceptible scale. These sites were crucial to sustaining the local movement community.
Thank you so much, LaShonda. The book is Drastic Dykes and Accidental Activists. I encourage you to pick up your copy. Click on the greenish button at the bottom, or the link is in the chat. Drastic Dykes and Accidental Activists, Queer Women in the Urban South. You can buy it from Charis Books and More and support a great group of queer women currently working in the urban South. Also, be sure to buy a copy for your friend. I know you are all going to find this book to be a wonderful read and exploration of our shared past. Thank you to ER and Dartricia and everyone at Charis for hosting us this evening. LaShonda, thank you so much for giving 20 years of your life to writing this book. I hope the next book comes out in a much shorter time frame for you. Thank you for talking with us tonight at the event. Thank you to the whole audience for your great comments and questions. And ER, I'll now turn the program back over to you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm coming back up. My camera's being a little slow here. There we go. I want to let folks know, in honor of Women's History Month, Charis is doing a fun thing, which is we've kicked off a campaign called You Had to Be There, and it's a deep dive into Charis's archive. It is mostly taking place on our Instagram, which I know not everyone is on Instagram, but everyone can look at our Instagram and follow along. Many of y'all were there for various parts of Charis's history. And so we would love for you to chime in and add your stories. We're going from the 70s up to today, and we're sharing little bits of this history. So it's stuff about Alpha. It's charting many of the same things that LaShonda is charting in her work. So if you're here tonight, if you're a fan of Sinister Wisdom, if you're a fan of all of this cultural work, I think that you would really get a kick out of it. The underlying goal is that we are working to get more cornerstone donors, which are monthly donors of $10 or more. So that's our transparent financial goal. But our goal is also to help us lead into our 50th birthday, which is next year. So if you're somebody who has a lot of great stories, comment on one of those things or send us an email and let us know, because I am kind of in the process of doing this story gathering. We put our archive is at the Sally Bingham Center at Duke, which is where many wonderful lesbian Southern archives are and Southern feminist archives are. So I also would love for folks to look at those finding aids and see whose name in those archives, because there's so much present history in those archives. So thanks so much for being here. LaShonda, this is such a wonderful book. We're really happy for you and happy that it is in the world. And Julie, thank you so much, as always, for all that you do for all of our communities.
Thank you
all. Thanks. Have a good night.
Have a great night. Bye-bye.